Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Specialty Crop Corner. Myself, Dwayne Rigsby. We have Brad Bergerford with us here, as always. Brad, as we've been going through these series, we've been talking about hops. Today, we're going to be talking about cultivar selections. So, anything we need to plan on, I guess, before we pick the cultivar selection. I got a question for you. How far ahead should we be thinking about this before?
Oh, that's a very good question, Dwayne. And yeah, we've been covering here this month about specialty crop that's in high demand in Ohio by our Ohio craft brewing industry, and that is hops. So we've been every week talking about little preparations that new farmers need to do if they're thinking about growing hops. And today's is probably the most important. We probably should have kicked this session off at the beginning of the month with this cultivar selection and planting, because you are correct. You can actually never start planting too far in advance when it comes to growing hops and selecting that cultivar to raise for the craft brewers. I'd say if a farmer could do their homework and have that decision made up to a year in advance, that means meeting with the brewers. You know, we have over 300 breweries in Ohio, Dwayne, and why do we have 300? Well, everyone makes their own little type of brew. And what's the distinguishing factor between all those different types of brew styles is hops. There's a few other things like the barley and the malt and so forth. But when it comes to those brews making themselves stand out from all the other 300 breweries, it usually comes down to hops. So for sure, any new grower is going to want to meet with that brewery first and brainstorm with them in terms of what cultivars are you using in your craft brews. And then the farmer needs to work backwards. Once they've got their markets established with the type of cultivars that their market wants, then we got to find the cultivars. So we'll talk a little bit about cultivar selection here as we go this morning, but it could take you almost a year between deciding on a cultivar, deciding where you can find that cultivar, and then deciding where can you purchase that cultivar, because not all are readily available. So I think we'll just roll right on in with the slides for today then, Dwayne. And
yes, sir.
As we've been talking about, we do a lot of specialty crops research down at the South Centers at Piketon, and hops has been our newest one in the last 10 years and has been probably the fastest growing industry in Ohio in terms of specialty crops, in terms of the high demand we have. And for those of you that may have missed previous sessions, when we grow hops, we grow them a little bit different than we do a lot of our other traditional specialty crops. We grow them on a big, tall trellis that's about 20 to 22 feet in the air. And then as this planting matures, it really gets heavy. So you see those wires across the top, those are aircraft cable, and that's how we hang the hops off of those aircraft cable. And again, if you haven't participated in our previous sessions, this is what the hops plant looks like. It'll grow, like I said, well over 20 foot tall. And when we have a full crop on it, as you can see here, the hop cones, that's a full crop, and that gets pretty heavy. So that's why we need that big structure in order to hold that crop up, because I've been in hop yards, not in Ohio, thank goodness, but I've been in hop yards in Wisconsin and Minnesota where I just happened in, and they didn't do a good job of preparing that trellis and preparing the crop planting in advance, and the whole trellis had fallen down or the poles snapped. So we would like to prepare our farmers, and one of those preparations, like we're talking about today, is preparing to plant and cultivar selection. So last week, we talked about how important it is to get that soil into shape, get your nutrient values up, watch for any carryover residual herbicides or so forth that could be on there from previous crops. So we pretty well have this all done. And again, just like the timing, Dwayne, on the cultivar selection, we do it maybe up to a year in advance. We have to get the soils prepped. I'd like to see that up to a year in advance, because when we're dealing with Mother Nature, she don't move very fast in terms of changing. So I think we finished last week with, at this stage, we built our beds. We had laid our landscape fabric down, which is the same landscape fabric that you use in the landscape, just a polypropylene material, porous, allows the water and nutrients through, but it does control the weeds because we just don't have any good labeled herbicides for use on hops in Ohio, just because it is a minor crop for us. So today we're going to talk about what types of hops for Ohio. And really, it comes down to what we just discussed, Dwayne. It comes down to what's that brewer want. You just don't go haphazardly onto the internet and find a variety that sounds like a neat name and decide you're going to grow it, because hops take about 3 years to mature. So you're not going to get a full crop till year 3. And then if you haven't done your homework in terms of lining up what varieties your buyer wants, you may show up with variety X, and that brewer doesn't use variety X because they make a different style of beer. And so then you've just made yourself about a $15,000 to $20,000 mistake because you just planted the wrong variety for your market, not to mention the 3 years it took to get to that harvestable stage. So I have learned through this development of the hops industry that cultivar selection is right up there as one of the most important items that a grower needs to prepare for. It's not the production, it's not the actual fieldwork stuff, it's this prepping in order to determine what your market is and what your market wants. Then we have a few other things, like it's not hard enough to grow the varieties that our buyers want. Here in the Midwest and in Ohio, one of the reasons hops left the Midwest and Ohio 100 years ago was because of disease pressures. And we have some different pests and diseases here in the Midwest and in Ohio than the Pacific Northwest has. So some of varieties that we would grow are more susceptible to these insect and disease pests, and others are more resistant. However, we may not be able to grow those resistant varieties. One variety is Columbus. Columbus has done very well at all 3 of our OSU sites in terms of production. In terms of disease and insect resistance, not so good. It's one of the most susceptible varieties to downy mildew, which is a major, major disease. That's what wiped out the industry. One of the many things besides prohibition that wiped out the industry back 80 years ago or so. So we still have that disease today. But the brewers like Columbus. So what do? You know, you got a market that they're willing to pay a good price for Columbus, but it's tough to grow. As a grower, it comes down to economics. We got to pay the bills, got to make the money. So we're probably going to choose to grow Columbus for our market, but we're just got to do some things different. And we'll talk about that in future episodes, Dwayne, is how could we grow Columbus with its downy mildew susceptibility? What are some tactics, production tactics we can do to grow that variety? So we'll talk about that in future programs, but we need to keep in mind when we're selecting those varieties of that disease and pest susceptibility that those particular varieties have. Because hops are new to Ohio, we at Ohio State, as well as our growers throughout the state, are continuously giving new varieties to the craft brewers around Ohio so they can actually do some testing of these new varieties that maybe have never been grown or used here by brewers before. Excuse me, but we've actually got a few brewers in Ohio now using some of these non-traditional varieties because we grew them in our research plots, gave them to the brewers to do their brewing testing with, and lo and behold, it was a variety that made a really good specialty. And now they have switched up and are growing some of those varieties. So we're always testing new varieties, and the brewers are one of the major folks that are helping us to determine what varieties possibly they could use in their brew houses and what might appeal to the consumer. Working with our Ohio Hop Growers Guild, which is like a cooperative that our Ohio Cooperative Development Center there at Piketon formed back almost 10 years ago. They received some grant funding and actually did a craft brewing survey of all the craft brewers in Ohio. And the results of that survey came back that, yes, the craft brewers are interested in looking at new varieties that maybe aren't the traditional varieties, and they're willing to purchase these newer varieties from growers. So everything in terms of our marketing leads us and has shown us that new variety selection and new variety testing is important to our craft brewing industry. Maybe that economic edge that our growers are looking for. So really, when you look at how many hop varieties are worldwide, there's well over 100 varieties. We have not had the resources or the people or the manpower to test 100 varieties, but we have tested between on-farm research and our 3 OSU sites at Piketon, at Worcester, and at Bowling Green. We've tested just a few more than 30. I think we're up to 32 of the varieties, and not all of those are in replicated research trials. Some are just observational trials. But as a researcher, that's what we want to do. We usually do a little observation planning first. Observation means it's a single replicate, one row, and we just look at it to see if it grows well, if it has some disease or insect susceptibility, and then we can actually smell it and do the chemical analysis to see if if that hop variety will produce the brewing characteristics that we want. And then once we get the observational data in, which could be up to 2-3 years, then we can go ahead and choose those varieties that look promising for the industry and for our growers. Then we put them into full-blown replicated trials where we actually replicate those varieties and those treatments throughout the field and actually collect some really, really good replicated data for the research results to give our growers the information they need to grow them. So basically at this point, we can grow just about every variety in Ohio, but we have a lot more testing to do, and we'll talk about cultivars here in a bit. But just how do you even grow hops? Well, back when we started our research trials back almost 10 years ago now, the only way you could grow or only way you could plant hops is with rhizomes or root pieces. In this picture here, you see, Dwayne, there is a picture of a rhizome, and that's all it is. It's just like a rhizome on any of our perennials in the landscape. Those perennials need to be thinned out every once in a while, and rhizomes are what we do to our established hop plantings, and we thin them out every 3-4 years. And there's the root pieces that are thinned out of those plantings. So if that planting is disease-free and has no virus or anything in it, we purchase the rhizomes then from nurseries that have disease-free stock, or we can even use our own. Say we've planted a couple 100 feet a row, it's done well, we've kept the disease out, we can actually in year 3 divide our own hops and use the rhizomes and the root pieces from our own field and go ahead and make our planting bigger. So that's going to save you some money, because the biggest cost besides the trellis is the plants or the rhizomes, and they're going to cost you anywhere from $1 to $2 for a rhizome and upwards to $5 for a plant. And we'll show you plants here in a little bit, but that's just a horizontal underground root piece that we have on all of our plants. You can take that same root piece, plant it to the field, or you can pot it up. Now rhizomes, we have a very narrow window. We're only going to be able to plant rhizomes to the field from April through May, and it does not suffice to a direct field planting in the summer months. There we would have to pot them up and then plant the potted plants. But we do plant those directly in the cell, all hand planted. No planters available. We plant them 2 inches deep, and then try to get as many of those buds. See those white buds pointing up there? We try to get as many of those buds point upwards in order to help that plant establish. But like I said, we can pot them up first, and then 2 months later we can put them into the field. And we usually space our plants or our rhizomes 3 feet in the row, 10 to 12 feet between rows, or wider. That's one thing we found, that some varieties, we should widen the row spacing and widen the in-row spacing, because that can help reduce our disease susceptibility. But we'll talk about that in future programs. This is the new way the industry has went in the last 6 years, and I'm glad to say that we do have our own Ohio hop plant propagator now in Ohio. So we can buy locally grown hop plants. These are plants that are started from vegetative cuttings, not root pieces. So a nursery has a mother planting of a certain variety. They'll take the vegetative cuttings, basically any time of the year except in the winter, and then they vegetatively propagate those in those grow tubes that you see that where that person's holding that potted plant or that plant. That would be in a tray, a plastic tray, and that is our propagating tray. So you would stick the rhizome in there, put it under not the rhizome, excuse me, the vegetative cutting into the propagating tray, put it under a propagating mist system, get it to root, and then it'll be ready in about 6 to 8 weeks. So again, your first question, Dwayne, how much in advance do we need to prepare just to get this potted plant? If we can even find the nursery that has the mother stock, then it's going to take at least 2 months. And it may be even later than that because a lot of the popular varieties. So we need to line up our plants at least a year in advance. And this is basically the way the industry has went now with the potted plants. Because with a potted plant, we can plant from April 1. And I've seen farmers in Ohio, I wouldn't recommend this late of a date, but they have planted up until the last week of September and still had a successful stand established. So the planting window is much wider when we use a potted plant compared to using that rhizome. But this is just what the rhizome's a little bit more close up of those buds, and we want to plant those buds upright. And then we left last week with laying the landscape fabric. How do we plant through that hard landscape fabric? Well, we go ahead and mark out our 3 to 4 foot in-row plant spacings, and we just use a propane torch to burn that hole. We don't really want to cut that hole because this is a woven fabric, and if we cut it, then the wind can actually fray that fabric and the whole thing will unravel itself over time. So by using a propane burner and burning that hole, we actually melt that fabric and there's no chance that it'll ever unravel in the wind. Then it's all, like I said, hand work. So we'll hand plant the rhizomes or hand plant the potted plants. And here's a picture of one of our students hand planting the rhizomes. So again, it's a lot of back breaking, knee type work that you need to keep in mind. So we're going to finish up here on some of the varieties that we've tested. Not going to go over all the data. And we have not, like I mentioned, have not tested all varieties. But there are dogs, there are racehorses that we have found that grow well in Ohio. Some of the dogs, the brewers want to pay good money for. So it's worth looking at both the dogs and the racehorses. But when it comes down to your cultivar selection, it's what the brewer and the buyer wants. No, you don't take anything more home today. Just grow the varieties your brewer or buyer wants, because you don't need to make a big mistake planting the wrong variety. So just to lay out some of the varieties we've tested that have shown good promise and our growers have adopted. Fuggles, that's one of those dogs. It doesn't yield well, but it does grow well in Ohio, but it has a lower yield. But boy, the brewers really like that one. Willamette, that's been one that's done good. Cascade has done very well for us in Ohio, majority of our growers. And a new one of our barley breeders actually at OSU gave us some cuttings of Cultivar Tradition. Again, only for particular brews, so you'll have to line this up with your buyer in advance, but it has done well. All of these are more adapted to our cool spring climates, and some are showing some resistance to downy mildew and spider mites. Some of the other ones that are looking promising that our growers have adopted, Galena, Nugget, Chinook, Columbus. I love Columbus, except for that disease susceptibility, so you got to keep that in mind. It's a very versatile variety. The brewers buy a lot of Columbus, but it does not have that downy mildew tolerance. So you have to do a few things different to keep that downy out. We've also looked at Brewer's Gold, Bullion, Magnums, lots and lots more. Maybe if we had a future program, we can go over some of the data maybe next week of over 3 years, how these varieties have performed for us at Piketon. But again, each has more or less susceptibility to downy mildew, hops, aphids, and spider mites. But Cascade is a good versatile one. If you just want to choose a variety without knowing a market, you can't go too wrong with Cascade. Lots of brewers use Cascade. So again, before you jump into lots of acres, always experiment on your own farm, because what's done well on ours may not do as well on your own farm. So always experiment before you make the big jump or plunge into new variety selections. And again, you can go to our website where we have all of our research trial results going back to the beginning of this hops project back 9-10 years ago. And we published those results, and lots of growers use those results. You know, again, you don't want to base your entire farm's decision on ours, because our soils are different, our climate's different, our farms are different. But when you look at one variety has done well at Worcester, Piketon, and Bowling Green, 3 different sites in Ohio, 3 different soil types, there's a pretty good chance it's going to do just as well at your farm. But again, before you make that jump, you always want to do that research on your own farm and actually grow a few out to experiment. And if you haven't already subscribed to our OSU Hops email list, you can do that again from our website, go.osu.edu/hops listserv. So with that, hopefully this gets folks thinking a little bit about how important it is, Dwayne, to select that variety for the buyer and the market that you're growing for, would like to grow for, and then the timeliness, like you asked from the very beginning. You can't start planning a hops planting or choosing your cultivars. I don't think you can do it early enough. More months, more years out, the better off you'll be. So is there any questions from today's program?
Got a few, Brad. Back when you were talking about, obviously, talking to your brewer about the variety, would you recommend going all in with one variety for your field, or would you recommend splitting the field up with a couple varieties? So I guess that's the first question.
Yeah, and that's an individual decision that is made according to the individual's business plan. And if you don't have a business plan established for your hop farm yet, definitely check with our folks at Piketon, our Small Business Development Center folks, or any in your area, because that comes down to that business planning. Some folks want one variety, harvest it, and be done because they don't have the labor, they don't have the time, they may have another job or farm other commodities that they don't have time to lengthen the harvest season out for 6 weeks. They want to harvest for them at 1 week or 10 days and be done. So I do have farmers doing both. I have them growing one variety like Cascade, comes on early, harvest it, and they're done. They go on to harvesting corn or soybeans or other produce. Others are just hop farmers. That's what they do. So they will grow multiple varieties that their brewers want, and they will be harvesting up to 10 and 12 weeks, depending on where they're at in Ohio and the weather in the season. So really, that comes down to your individual business plan and your market. But if you definitely have a market that'll buy 3-4 varieties, and you can manage that, those folks are doing well because it keeps their cash flow coming in for a longer period of time. A very good question.
Okay, another question would be, so how much would you theoretically have to raise in order to be able to sell? Is an acre too much? Is an acre not enough? When you're doing this selection, obviously, again, it's going to come back to your business plan.
Yes.
But if you're just trying to raise one row, probably you're not going to be able to find that brewer that, well, they might, I don't know, you might end up only with a couple of dry bags or something.
Yeah, and that's what's cool about Ohio breweries is they will buy from a smaller farmer that maybe just has a couple, 20 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. When we get to full maturity, we're going to harvest a good yield, about 1,000 pounds of dried hops, about a pound per plant, and we plant about 1,000 plants to the acre. So that gives folks, and again, it comes down to your business plan, like you mentioned, but that gives folks an idea of what an acre will produce. So you're looking at, you could be up to 1,000 pounds. But again, your brewers, most of the brewers are so cool, they're working with folks that are just a quarter acre, just a couple rows. Or if you're your own brewer, that's even better because you're in charge of when you're going to use it and how much you need. So a couple rows may work better for that craft brewer, but like the Portsmouth Brewing Company just south of us there at Portsmouth, they will just buy 10 pounds, 5 pounds, 20 pounds from a grower as long as it's good quality. And we'll have another program on quality of hops here later this summer.
Good. That sounds really good. We got just a few minutes left, Brad. One other question about, you said there's a way that you can make your field larger by splitting the rhizome. Can you split the rhizome of the potted plant the same way, or is it any different?
No. Once that plant gets established, we hit that 3 to 4 year mark is about when you need to divide your rhizomes, because just like any perennial, it gets too thick. So no, whether you use rhizomes from the beginning or whether you use a potted plant, that potted plant will end up producing a lot of rhizomes as well in that 3 to 4 years. So as long as you keep the disease out, you don't have no virus, you don't have no downy mildew in there, you can propagate from any planting with your own rhizomes when you hit that 3 to 4 year maturity.
Good, good. I just wanted to make sure that even with the potted plant, it worked the same way. And then
Yep.
when you go to split it, is that the time to do it in the winter time? When is the exact time that you should split that?
Very good question. And just like most perennials, the earlier in the late winter, early spring that you can get into the field and actually do that work, the better. We found out the hard way at Piketon. Our first year, this actually hop yard you see in the picture here, we went to divide that in year 4, and the weather, just like we had the rainy weather this spring, it was a rainy spring, and we didn't get into divide that till early part of May. And it stunted the plants back because they'd already started coming out of dormancy. They started growing. The best time to do those divisions is before that plant breaks dormancy. You're going to have less stress on the plant. We sacrificed yield that year, but we had to do it. But we were just late because we do it with tractors and we do it mechanical means, and it was just way too muddy that spring. So we were delayed. But try to do it when weather and soil conditions permit, starting in March up and through April.
Awesome. Brad, just a couple of questions or a couple of minutes left. Any last words? How do we get a hold of you for questions, things like that? And also visit our website, southcenters.osu.edu.
Yes, correct. You can go to our South Centers website. We have a whole section devoted just to hops production, not just cultivar selection and planting, but everything we've done over the last 10 years. And then, yes, we're still working from home here, but if you just call down at Piketon, or you can email me, Bergeford, BERGEFURD.1 at osu.edu. We do have field nights planned, our annual hop field nights at all 3 locations in August, trying to figure out how we're going to do those because we're not allowed to host public events as of today. So we may be doing some virtual hop field days or something, but there's always opportunities for continuing education in hops.
Yep. Well, Brad, we're out of time for this session. So until next week, we'll see everyone next Monday.